you mentioned sort of there's this fissure between that the way of feeling quote unquote in touch with your Chinese identity comes from using the Chinese language, but we should always, remember that Chinese thought and Chinese language are separate, right? You can express Chinese thought through English, and you can express English thought through the Chinese language.
Yeah, which is probably essentially what I'm doing. Is my use of Chinese is still heavily English in terms of its syntax, in terms of its concepts. It's not a sort of Chinese Mandarin that I'm speaking yet. It's an Englishified Mandarin. I guess there's a hope that by learning Mandarin as a language, that will lead me into a more quote-unquote Chinese way of thinking. That you can't have proper access to Chinese thought without some sense of how Mandarin works as a language and some degree of mastery over it.
Do you believe that, though, or do you feel like that's what people sort of like are telling you, essentially?
Because I've studied Chinese poetry and I've been so seduced by it, and poetry is a very essential form of the language. I think that's where I get a more authentic idea of the thoughts and the concepts that come out of Mandarin as a language, rather than this, parental pressure to learn it. There's the Tang Dynasty masters of the poetry of the language that does something that English can't.
Right.
Yeah.
It's funny because I think we're both far more trained into Western aesthetics than Chinese.
Exactly. Yeah. Which is why I feel a bit like an Orientalist when I'm approaching Chinese aesthetics.
Yeah.
Because it's with a kind of fully Western mind. And I have the same fascination that Ezra Pound or Roland Barthes have.
Right.
With Chineseness. Yeah. But I'm also curious about how you understand your constellation of aesthetics to be Western.
I feel a greater degree of closeness and relatability to those texts than I do with like Chinese media. Like watching a Wong Kar-wai film or whatever, like feels distant to me. Where like I feel watching, I don't know, like a Don Hertzfeldt film, I feel like he's actually expressing something quintessentially close to me.
Yeah, and there's also questions about humanism and universalism in these artworks too, that a good artwork can touch beyond cultural boundaries, of course, and that maybe, you can't fully get the nuances of Wong Kar-wai because part of that is in the language, whereas English media, you get the full experience, a fuller experience of it.
I suppose I also feel like with like, for example, Swedish media or like just European media, like I feel heavy identification with like Antonioni films or Bergman films, at least when I was younger, and I didn't know the language.